Hello. Hello and welcome. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever you are. I'm Lucas Febraro, standing in for our usual host, Marian Khalili, who's away this week. And we're DiEM25, a radical political movement for Europe. Welcome to another live debate with our coordinating team featuring subversive ideas you won't hear anywhere else. Today, we're here to answer a simple question. Is this European Union worth joining? The war in Ukraine is disrupting life across Europe, but some countries in the eastern part of the continent are finding themselves at an additional crucial crossroads. Should they join this EU or choose something else? From North Macedonia to Ukraine to Georgia, many countries have expressed interest in joining the EU at some point. In some cases, these are symbolic candidacies that exist only on paper for now. But in others, especially in ex-Yugoslavia, negotiations between national governments and Brussels are in advanced stages. A couple of days ago, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said, "I am committed to the enlargement of the EU. That the EU continues to grow eastward is a win-win for all of us." Is it really? And if not, what other realistic options are there? We have a panel today of people with unique perspectives on this question, four of which either live in or have roots in countries from ex-Yugoslavia. Ivan Nenadovic and Maja Pelevic from Serbia, Dusan Pajovic from Montenegro, and the North Macedonia-born and Germany-raised Juliana Zita. In addition, we have Yanis Varoufakis and the rest of our campaigning and policy team to give us an European take. Lastly, we have you watching us live. If you have anything you want to ask, put your questions in the YouTube chat and we'll get them answered as best as we can. To start us off, let's hear from Ivana, Maya, Dusan, and Juliana about their perspectives from some of the countries that are likely to be next in line to join the EU. Guys, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lucas, for this introduction, and thank you everybody who is joining us tonight to discuss this not as simple question as Lucas introduced it, but we will try to clarify our stances or our perspectives a bit. And I would like to start with giving a bit of a context because I feel it's necessary because even in our coordinating collective, when we were agreeing about the topic, we were floating around different terms like ex-Yugoslavia and where it should or could move. Are the Balkan countries next to enter the EU? Is the Balkan some joint entity? And what is Balkan? Is it a geographical term or it's just a handful of countries from this region that are not members of the EU yet? So I think that, first of all, my opinion is that we cannot approach this as a Balkan question or ex-EU question, but we need to approach each country individually, having in mind what was happening with each country from ex-Yugoslavia after the collapse of Yugoslavia and in the last 30 years. Is this EU worth joining? A simple question with a simple answer is no. However, if we answer that simple question, the next one is what is an alternative and is there an alternative? Also speaking from a Serbian perspective and being on this very long accession process and having this carrot on the stick during all of the conditions and conditionings that EU has put in front of us. One of them, for example, being worsening our union and labor laws to adopt them to EU laws, which are precarious and so on, while Serbia still had a good law about working rights from Yugoslavia. So not all of the changes are good for us on our road towards European values. Some of them, of course, like fighting the corruption or adjusting our court system and exterminating corruption in the legal system, of course, should be beneficial for each country, regardless of their membership in EU or any other group. Another maybe misconception is that it's up to these countries, it's up to us whether we want to join the EU or not. There is no choice, basically, and we need to obey everything, and we need to be good servants of our new lords. This might sound harsh, but I think that's the case. In Serbia, in particular, the other option, because there is nothing in between, either or, black or white, EU values or Russian hell. So being an Orthodox country as well, for Serbian people that are disappointed in everything that's been going on for the past 30 years, and EU basically not wanting us, it's not about us not wanting to join, but EU refusing us all the time and finding new and new levels for us to pass. The other side to turn is Mother Russia as the Orthodox country, and also we need to recognize the sentimental connection between Serbia and Russia, dating from the Second World War, when the Russian Red Army liberated Belgrade and Serbia and so on. So there is an emotional connection. It's not rational. We need just to have that in mind. So I would like to pass the floor now, not to speak too much. I just touched upon some topics that I would like to clarify. I myself have more questions than I have answers, and I would like us to maybe come closer to some answers, and also answer a question: how much is a non-EU country really sovereign before joining the EU? And how is it possible, if it's even possible, to keep sovereignty at this point? And also, how would non-alignment look like these days when we have in mind that, for example, Serbia doesn't want to impose sanctions to Russia, but then it will turn badly for Serbia? I'm not saying that the Serbian government is doing anything right, don't get me wrong, but if we try to practice unalignment, then we are not standing on any side. So this is it from me for now. Maya, maybe you would like to take it from here.
Thank you, Ivana, a lot. I'm Maya Pelić, also from Serbia. Before we pass the floor to Montenegro, which has a little different situation than here in Serbia, which is really weird because till recently we've been the same country, but the politics are a little bit different. So Ivana, thank you for this introduction. I think it's very important that you gave this introduction to the whole, in a way, socio-political floor that we have concerning our position to the war in Ukraine and towards the EU integration. Lucas, you also mentioned one thing, and that is that some countries are in advanced stages of entering the EU, which Serbia is in a way. But it's really very funny to say advanced stages when our process of becoming a EU member started in the early 2000s, 22 years ago. And now, after, of course, the fall of Milosevic and getting the first democratic government, and it's been, and in a way, we have been going by baby steps towards this EU integration, and the end is not near. From 2019 to 2021, no new clusters were opened for getting a membership in the EU. And now recently, of course, we are talking about Ukraine becoming a full member of the EU, not mentioning these countries that have been waiting for it for more than 20 years. So, and now I think the date we have, the new date is 2030. That's the one we got, the last date. So it's like 30 years of waiting to become a full member of the European Union. And of course, what Ivana is saying, we have been doing a lot of things that we had to do towards our, in a way, masters, if we can call it that way, thinking about us as in a way, non-sovereign country. So I think this is also very important to know, that it's been a very, very tough path for 30 years. So it's not weird to see that here in Serbia now in the 2022 you have Euroscepticism, and I'm not sure if there was a referendum how many people would say that they would enter the EU, because now I think 80% of people recently in some polls are for Russia actually. What Ivana was saying of this historical, cultural, and other emotional ties we have to Russia are very strong here. They are not realistic in any kind of way. And I think the only thing we are doing at this point in Serbia is trying to obtain in this very, very difficult situation, because we are a poor country. We depend on other countries. We depend on Russian gas. Also, a very important thing for people to know is that Serbia got the gas from Russia for a third of the price that Europe was getting. So now at this moment, we are trying to obtain some kind of micro-sovereignty. And when Ivana and I were talking a couple of days ago about a non-aligned movement or a non-aligned position we would have, I was saying that we are now not in a non-aligned position, but more in a too aligned, like too much aligned position, where we have to grab whatever we can, because in one way we are completely sure that the EU doesn't want us. We are completely irrelevant. They don't need us. We are surrounded by NATO countries. We are surrounded by EU countries. Even if some Russia troops could not enter Serbia, even if they would be surrounded by NATO. So in a way, when we think we are relevant, we are not relevant. That is a big problem. And also we are not relevant to Russia also, because now if we impose sanctions to Russia, nothing would happen to Russia. They would be a little bit sad and they would be, okay, our brothers, they gave us sanctions, but nothing would happen. So our only position at this moment is a realistic one. How are we going to manage to get through this winter? And that's what I think Serbia is at this moment trying to do. And I think it's a big problem to ask for Serbia to do a thing that would, in a way, maybe make a complete collapse of the whole country. And the whole baby steps we're doing towards EU, of course, we know that we will never enter EU before we enter NATO. Serbia will never enter NATO because it was bombed by NATO in 1999. Maybe we can talk about that also, because we have also this other military threat of NATO bombing a sovereign country just recently. And at the end of the day, also, I think it is a question of Kosovo at the end. We have to mention Kosovo. I know that it's not a popular thing to mention, but it is something that I think at the end of the day, Serbia will say, okay, so what is the difference between the situation in Ukraine and the situation with that we had with Kosovo in 1999? So I think all of these things can be a good reflection to think about. And I completely agree with Ivana. And I would now ask maybe Dusan to give an introduction about Montenegro. We can talk more. I completely agree with Ivana that I have a lot of questions and not many answers to this.
Thanks, Maya and Ivana. Basically, maybe we don't agree in some points, but we agree in the core, which is there is no ex-Yugoslavia, there is no Western Balkans. It's really country-specific and country-dependent. Even though we are leftists, all of us would probably shed a tear when we hear a song about Tito and stuff like that, but that just doesn't exist anymore. Why it's like that? Let me give you a brief context. First of all, we all have I will speak in terms of Montenegro. We have our history, our current and previous burdens. We have our own tensions, and none of that is anymore in alignment with Yugoslavia or anything which is the third path of neither EU or Russia. That third path just doesn't exist. Basically, why it's contextual? Well, Euro is in Montenegro since 2002, Euro as a currency. We already have for decades multinational banks. We have neo-colonial approach from both sides, of course. But after 30 years of same party ruling, we replaced them with extreme right-wing conservatives, extreme right-wing Serb conservatives. But what's incredibly important to stress here, it's not ethnical division in Montenegro, it's ideological. So when you look at the census before the war of 90s in Montenegro, you'd see that 90% of people were Montenegrins. And then it passed like that for a few years. And when the big party split into neoliberal Montenegrins and conservative Serbs, people chose one of those nations as a pool of their ideologies. It's incredibly complex and really interesting, especially as I'm coming from social psychology background. And it's something that I call symbolism of nation and nationalization of symbols. Now, don't get me wrong, both sides have something that's bad and something that's good, of course. Like Montenegrins are always, I cannot say always, but more usually prone to NATO, and Serbs aren't. On the other hand, Montenegrins are pro-LGBTQ, pro-feminism, pro-integration of immigrants, but Serbs aren't. Serbs are more touchy about the topics of corruption and economy, and Montenegrins are more touchy about the topics of social issues. I cannot say what's better or worse, but we need to integrate what's best of it and just forget about nation in the ideological sense of it. I mean, in a pool of ideologies. What's important to stress is that we don't have consensus here in Montenegro on anything, literally. Like there's always 51% and 49%. But we have consensus on one thing, which is EU integration. Before extreme right-wing won, we had like 80% of people that are up for joining EU. Now, after the war in Russia, it's still strong, it's 75. So it's not bad at all. The only alternative that is offered to either Russia or EU is an initiative called Open Balkan, which a lot of figures said that it's just first of all, big state project, and second of all, a way of easier smuggling cigarettes and drugs. That initiative is being supported by US and Russia, and it's not being supported by EU. Montenegrins don't want to go in it. People from Kosovo don't want to go in it. People from Bosnia and Herzegovina don't want it to go. But there are like these imperialistic tensions to dissolve the borders, which is crazy for me to say now because I'm an anarchist. I'm for open borders, but we cannot talk about that in a phenomenological sense and neglect the realistic side of it. For example, right now in Montenegro, it's the biggest imperial narrative is currently pro-Russian, pro-Serbian because they have political power. They created the government in a church. Our prime minister was appointed by the church and put as the first person that came in politics only because of the church affiliation, and so on and so on. But I don't want to neglect other imperialisms as well. Croats said that we are not yet done with the borders with Montenegro and Bosnia. The same thing happened with Albania. So extreme right wing has political power in if they are Serbs in Montenegro, but Croats, for example, also have some wishful thinking of territories. So basically, Montenegrins are united in a slogan which is made by Yugoslavia and by Tito, which is "We tuđe nećemo, svoje ne damo," which means we don't want what's foreign and we don't give what's our. Let me say this: it's more likely that Ursula will announce anarcho-syndicalism in EU starting tomorrow than for ex-Yugoslavia to come to life again, literally. So imperialism is just too strong. People just don't trust each other anymore. 90s are still fresh. There are border advocates for border changes across countries. And as we speak, I cannot get my license plates because there are Russian hacker attacks on Montenegro, because we are the biggest link of NATO and we have port. We are insignificant. We have 600,000 people, no military other than NATO and so on, but we do have a port. So we have hacker attacks, we have Russian spies that were caught, and we have head of National Security Agency taken down after he caught Russian spies and after he caught the ruling Green Party in cigarette smuggling. 2 days after those actions, he got taken down because the ruling majority now are just pioneers of Serbia and Russia. And our prime minister is opening, his brother is opening biggest clinic in Europe with the sister of a Serbian prime minister. So it's a lot of corruption, it's a lot of smuggling that's being hidden under nationalistic tensions, or even worse, being the battle against corruption is being presented in a form of rising nationalistic tensions. So it's the other way around this time. And I know this is weird to hear from me, but for people who are following my work in terms of article writing or speaking, but I think there is no alternative. Montenegro is not ready for yet another experiment, at least in terms of geopolitics, and we need to head towards EU if we really want to save our constitution that says that we are a multinational civic country that's multi-religious and secular.
I will just jump in here because I feel the need to emphasize what Dusan was saying about the situation in Montenegro these days, where ideology became nationality. So instead of declaring to which party you are a sympathizer of, you will declare yourself as a Serb or a Montenegrin. And listening from this side, Serbian side, you will again hear that Serbs and Serbian and Serb are doing something imperialistic and having territorial pretensions. I think it's ridiculous to talk about imperialistic tendencies of any country from this region. We are that tiny. But we shouldn't forget that there are territorial pretensions from Albania to North Macedonia, from Bulgaria towards North Macedonia. And when North Macedonia had this question in front of them, their reasoning, and I completely understand the reasoning, was we are tiny and alone, and it's better to join even a rotten alliance than to stand alone. Juliana, I think this is a good cue for you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, exactly right. I mean, we're talking about a 2 million people country here with North Macedonia. And I think, just a quick recap, when North Macedonia became a candidate, I was 17 years old. Now I'm 34. That's like, I doubled my age waiting for that to happen. And it's really for the people there. And I grew up in Germany. I live in Germany, and I go there and I have discussions. I'm like, the UN is not what you think it is. And I've changed my opinion about them joining over the time, because at some point I realized something essential. For the people, it's not about what the EU is and what all these politics, how all of this plays out and the geopolitics behind it. For the people, it's about their future, It's like, for me, for example, people ask me, why don't you have a German passport? And I'm like, because I have to give up my North Macedonian passport, and I have family there. It's not like I'm not a patriotic person, or it's not about nationality, but it's about choice. It's about the choice to keep my nationality and have the German nationality, for example. I cannot have that choice until North Macedonia enters the EU. My family, people want to work somewhere else in the EU. Everyone who is in the EU knows how, you can pack your stuff and you can go work in another country and you can go back and forth how you want. It's really about freedom to cross the borders. It's not about, everyone wants to leave the country and then North Macedonia and all the ex-Yugoslavia would be empty. That's not true. I don't think that will happen. But it's about the freedom of choice. And this is what people actually look for when they see to join the EU. It's not about the things we think about the EU while living in the EU and being a part of it. And it's easy to condemn these aspirations of countries and say, you don't understand what the EU is, and therefore you want to join, because coming from a place now, I have, my green card, I can move around the EU, and I have this opportunity, and I can work everywhere in the EU. And this kind of blinded me to the fact that they don't have this opportunity, and this is the reason why they stick to that choice. And with North Macedonia, we all know the one reason why it took so long on one hand was the veto from Greece. And I think the veto of Greece did even much more damage because it actually gave rise to a kind of very protective nationalism in North Macedonia. But I mean, still, we're talking about 2 million people. So we're talking still about a part of that population. It's not like everyone, but all of those corrupt politics. I mean, North Macedonia had 10 years of a horrible government, a really, really horrible government that took all the money from the people and put it into fake projects, putting it into their pockets. They emptied the whole country of its, money that the people paid in taxes. And that happened because they were the party that was standing against Greece. And this is how they get their votes. And I was happy when the Prespa agreement was done. I didn't, and many people in North Macedonia didn't care about what the actual name was. It was just the relief of this dispute, having this dispute gone. And it was very important. And now, there comes Bulgaria vetoing and going, yeah, wait a minute, you're Bulgarians, whatever. And it's driving you insane. And I have to say this at this point, I'm still proud of the North Macedonians, though, because they haven't lost their nerves at this point. They have changed their constitution. They will do it again. And they're still hanging on this path. And they're like, okay, fine, here, go ahead. You can have rights. You can have rights. Just let us in, for fuck's sake. And I think this is, for a small nation, something that even larger nations can look at and learn something from, to be honest. So much from me.
I completely resonate with Juliana. We are part of a small nation, like Montenegrins have 200,000 Montenegrins or something like that. And I cannot emphasize enough the similarities of imperialism. That's why I want to reply to Ivana, because it's public that half, I named them literally, you can read it in my article, more than a half of parties in Montenegro are being funded at least by a Serbian Orthodox Church or by Aleksandar Vučić directly. When you hear speeches, so I will name some of the key sentences from either President of Serbia, Defense Minister of Serbia, or MPs of Serbia that are in government. One of them said, Montenegro will be small Ukraine. One of them said, Russians in Ukraine, Serbs in Montenegro. One of them said, it's Serbians' fault that Montenegro has its independence. I don't want to turn this into nationalistic tendencies, but you can just open the books that are being taught in schools for children in Serbia, and you'll see that all of the Montenegrin dynasties are being called Serb dynasties. I even had the situation in DM where a friend of mine, and I know it's not ill-omened, said freshly formed nation of Montenegrins. That's just not true. That's just not according to history. And I don't want to talk about history. I don't care about it. But even if Montenegrin nation was formed today, it's still, and it's not. But even if it is, it's still the same relevancy as any other nation, because that's how nations are created. And basically, you know that when you walk across Montenegro, you'll see much more Serbian flags than Montenegrin flags. The key party that's in government is calling for a referendum again to be together with Serbia. That party is being funded by Serbia directly. We cannot neglect those issues at all. That's it.
Yeah, a lot to ponder. And we got a lot of comments coming in the chat as well. Dylan Hardy says, it's better to be a member of a bigger club like the EU than being alone. The EU can be reformed, but dictator-minded authorities such as Russia, Turkey, China, Iran, and many more would be worse. And I think that's sort of pervasive here. And I'm interested in hearing your take on this, Yanis, because there seems to be the sense of fatalism almost with, when we talk about EU enlargement, when we talk about Eurozone enlargement as well. We just saw Croatia, it being announced recently that Croatia is going to be joining the Eurozone starting next year, which is interesting because there's a sense of almost that it's unavoidable for some reason, even with the entire experience that we've had in the past decade with the euro, and especially now with all of the instability going on in the Eurozone. What's your take on all of this?
I'm very seriously and severely problematized. We've been around as a movement for 6 years. It feels like 6 centuries. The EU that we were hoping to reform, to democratize when we formed the M25, no longer exists. It is far more toxic than we ourselves imagined it could become. You saw in the last days what Borrell has said about this being a beautiful garden, about being invaded by the riffraff from outside. This is quasi-Nazi talk, coming from the center of our institutions. The EU has become nasty, brutish, and a threat to civilization over the last few years. Having said that, and with deep-seated respect for those of you in Montenegro, in Serbia, and so on, who feel that the EU, despite its toxicity, despite its deep reactionary nature these days, despite it having become anything other than a union, that and during a war that has rendered the EU an appendix to Washington, D.C. Nevertheless, I understand your position that you feel, not the position, the feeling that you have, that it is a kind of a safe port in a big storm that you're facing when you have Vučić on the one side and Putin and so on and so forth. So allow me to just share some thoughts. Firstly, there is a very big decision to be made when you enter the EU, because there is no way out of the EU that is not exceedingly painful, as Brexit has demonstrated. It's one thing to say, to consider entering. It's quite another thing to consider exiting. So there is hysteresis, as mathematicians say. So be very careful. Once you're in, you're locked in. And you have to be 100% sure that you really want to get in. The discussion that I heard from all of you, from Ivana, from Dusan, Juliana, from Maya, reminded me very much of the discussions that were raging here in Greece in the 1970s, when I was a young man and Greece was on the verge of becoming a member of the European Union, which was back then called the European Economic Community. Same thing. Same arguments. Same arguments. On the one hand, we were facing the specter of Orientalism, the condensation with which Europeans, Central Europeans, Northern Europeans, the Brits, the Americans, were looking at the Greeks as part, an appendage of the Ottoman Empire, which you experienced too in Serbia, in Montenegro, and so on. Then it was the Iron Curtain, just a few kilometers from Thessaloniki. The idea that, the reality that, my mother grew up in a fascist dictatorship. I grew up in a fascist dictatorship. In between, I had a civil war between, the forces supported by Stalin on the one hand and forces supported by the Pentagon on the other, and the British intelligence services. And I was also caught up in this wave of feeling that the EU is somewhere where we can be democratic and not have to fear the secret police in the middle of the night. And this is why, the majority of Greeks were in favor of entering the European Economic Community. But mind you, it was never tested by a referendum, because opinion polls at the time, even though they were tricky, but they're always tricky, the opinion polls, always unsafe, they were not showing a clear margin of victory for entering the European Economic Community. So I am conflicted about it. You mentioned Lucas, you mentioned Bulgaria entering the euro and Croatia entering the euro. These are criminal decisions by the governments of Bulgaria and Croatia. It's nothing more than criminal to enter the euro today. Effectively, you are giving up sovereignty in a manner which guarantees austerity forever. You just give away the right even to discuss economic policy effectively. Now, remember, if Serbia becomes a member of or North Macedonia or Albania becomes a member of the European Union, you're signing up to the euro. You're effectively committing to enter the Eurozone as well. I think that we should be very respectful of people in Montenegro, people in North Macedonia, who say, well, you don't know what it's like to live here. And we feel that entering the EU is a lesser evil. If that's what you say to me, Dusan, I would respect that. And, I would support a referendum amongst Montenegrins to enter the EU. I would never support the entry into the EU without a referendum, right? If I were a Montenegrin, I would vote against. I'm telling you this, but only because I've had 40 years of experience of being in the EU. So being in the EU gives you a different perspective to not being in the EU. So I respect that. But let me finish on a self-critical note. Self-critical personally and also DiEM-wise, a criticism of DiEM. When we set up DiEM25 in February of 2016, we were hoping to transform the European Union in such a way as to make it a good place for your countries, for the Balkan countries and other countries to enter. We've done exactly the opposite. We have failed, and the EU is a toxic place for the people who are within it, ruled by intellectual dwarfs who very quickly slide towards neo-Nazi language. This is the EU that you want to join. So it simply highlights the complete tragedy of Yugoslavia, that, after so many decades, you feel that things are so desperate that your best bet out of a bunch of bad bets is to enter this toxic EU. It's a collective failure of the whole of Europe. That's how I want to end.
Thank you, Yanis. And to use this as a segue, because you mentioned towards the end there, the intellectual dwarfs with the almost neo-Nazi language. Recently, the EU's Foreign Affairs Chief, Josep Borrell, used the appalling language in a public appearance in which he made an analogy and he referred to Europe as a garden and the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, as a jungle that has a growth capacity and wants to invade this garden, and we should protect the garden. We condemned it and we launched a petition, and as a matter of fact, calling for his resignation, and the link will be in the chat, and we invite you to sign it, and while you're there, to join the DiEM25 as well, if you like what you're hearing here in this discussion. Eric, can I bring you in? Eric Edman, our political director.
Sure. I also was conflicted preparing for this live stream. I didn't know what my position was. Do we want countries to be joining the EU? And I say countries and not ex-Yugoslavia, West Balkans, or anybody, because I think as DiEM we have a responsibility to at least try and have pan-European positions. So we either think that the EU is worth joining or it's not. If we sit there and say that it's worth joining for Montenegro, but it's not for Iceland or whatever have you, I think we should be doing more than that. And the answer to whether or not it's worth joining, I think, hinges on our answers on 2 points. The first one is, does the EU do more good than bad? We all agree it does bad. We know that. This is DiEM, we're very critical of the EU. But if we're saying that countries should be joining it, we're essentially saying that there's a little bit more on the side of good than there is on bad, on the balance at the end of the day compared to the alternative. So first we need to answer that. And the second question is, if more countries join the EU, does that make our task, our mission, our challenge of radically transforming the EU easier or harder? That's the other question that we need to answer. Is it better for changing the EU radically if we have more countries, more governments joining this EU? So taking the first question, is it more good than bad? I'm not going to go into too much detail. Essentially, the point of these live streams is to talk about these things. The EU is killing refugees left, right, and center, unless they're white Christian Ukrainians. The EU has become essentially a geopolitical annex of NATO. The EU, in the 2008 crisis, in the pandemic, in the refugee crisis, now with the energy crisis, every opportunity it's had, it's tried to bail out the rich and powerful, put more money in the 1%, and throw the rest of us under the bus. What has the EU done to help Hungarians, Poles, the Catalonians from their governments, the Greeks from their governments? How have they helped? In Romania, we're running a campaign to renationalize energy, which was nationalized and is essentially owned by a bunch of European, Central, German and French, essentially, companies, to the point where Romanians are now paying more money to get energy to their houses than the state would be paying to have free energy for everybody. That's the EU anybody would be joining who joins today. In Greece, we have a political party in government whose one of its core pillars of existence is fighting the European Union and what the European Union has done, together with the IMF. But the European Union was one of the main architects of this. So this is the European Union that we are basically asking other citizens to want to join compared to the alternative. And, back in 2015, during the renegotiation of the Greek debt, we said that if we're serious about really changing Greece's position within the euro, we need to be prepared for Greece to leave the euro. I think we also need to apply exactly the same principle when it comes to radically reforming the European Union. If we're going to have this fight with the EU, we need to also be prepared to not be a part of this EU. That's not saying that this is what we're aiming for, but we're saying that that is a preferred alternative to this European Union continuing to exist another day longer, or for us being a part of it for that matter. So that is my, I think, position after a lot of soul searching, that at the end of the day, this European Union is not worth existing. And although it hides behind, it's toxic how it hides under small perks. This idea that, you have cleaner waters in the EU, or, in the EU, there's a pandemic recovery fund, which is pushing us further into debt, or that, we bailed out the Greeks. This is all EU talk, which basically throws ashes in the eyes of radical activists and makes them think that it's worth, not even that it's worth, it just plants little seeds of doubt. And it's really, really dangerous. And we need to be very honest about what the reality is about this EU and what you're really buying into when you join it. That's the answer to the first question. And the second point about whether or not it makes it easier to reform, the more governments that have joined the EU, the more sclerotic and inflexible and chaotic it's become. You can draw a line in 2004, before the enlargement of 2004 and after. And that is because this European Union was not designed to deal with this kind of political plurality, because it's not democratic. Democracy can absorb that. This EU is not democratic. It cannot deal with it. So it's been completely failing consistently from the beginning of the 21st century onwards. And by adding more countries, more governments, more people to that, we're basically making that problem even worse. So I think, and I know this is quite heavy sounding, because I live in Brussels, and I moved to Brussels because I love the idea of the European Union, which is why I hate this European Union so very much. And if we're going to be honest about what we're trying to do in Europe, I think we need to be unequivocal about the fact that there is no circumstance under which we can suggest that anybody should be in favor of joining the European Union, regardless of the circumstances. It's never a worthy alternative.
Thanks, Eric. Juliana, I think you mentioned you have a question.
Yes, and it has to do with something that Eric said just now. As you said, Eric, it got more chaotic the more member it got. And if we look at members like Poland and Hungary, for example, they are giving the EU a completely unnecessary new spin, of nationalism and so on. But couldn't it be also true that if you would have those countries like Serbia, like North Macedonia, if they would join the EU, that you could maybe also change the dynamic of of the EU with those countries? Imagine all of Europe, what we consider Europe as a country on this continent, would be in the EU. You're right, it would be more chaotic, but it could be also maybe an opportunity to muddle things up and to change things, because it would also matter to people in Serbia, in North Macedonia, to get themselves involved in the debates in the EU and in all of that, which we do now already as people who live in the EU countries. We are politically organized because of the EU and because we wanted to change it. And now we are at a different point where we have to renegotiate ourselves. What do we want to do with this union, But it can also be like more helping hands, more people pointing to the faults of the EU. So this is kind of my question, that it maybe, and yes, with the euro, I agree with Janus completely. If I imagine like North Macedonia having the euro, it would be a really, really, really shit life for the people there. They wouldn't maintain what they have today, even. I think when North Macedonia would join fully, that's true. But can it not be also an opportunity to, to unite the people and therefore change EU with all its citizens and not just with those who are now members and the rest is outside waiting for a union that's joinable, So, yeah, I think you got my question, right? So can it not have a positive effect for us?
Also go first, Janus, maybe?
Then I wanted to ask a question. of me as well.
Also, the very quick one, just to put another perspective that I'm thinking, okay, if all, because you mentioned 20 and 30 years of waiting, if this waiting by itself, I'm sure, creates a different strategy, in the economy of the country. And I'm wondering what would have happened in those 20 or 30 years, or what will happen if you don't want to get in anymore, if there's a referendum, whatever, hypothetically. Would all this energy and dynamics that are going to waste, I suppose, in a way, have changed the economy, and those countries could have been in a better position? I mean, the waiting itself, I suppose, drains out possibilities for other things, and that's a question.
It didn't in the case of Turkey. Turkey has been waiting actually longer than any other country. In the process, Turkey stopped wanting to be part of the EU. It maintains its place as a candidate member state just in order to annoy the EU. But I have zero doubt that even if the EU begged Erdogan and Turkey, indeed even the opposition, to enter the EU, Turkey would say, not on your Nelly. So it's not necessarily the case that if you're waiting long enough, then not getting in is a tragedy. Look, folks, to your question, Juliana, might not the entry of Montenegro and North Macedonia help us, progressives, reshuffle and transform the EU? No, I don't think so. Firstly, from my experience, small countries are completely and utterly ignored by the powers that be. It really doesn't matter what the North Macedonian or the Montenegrin is going to say in any EU Council meeting. In any case, EU Council meetings do not decide anything. It's all done by a Central European cartel-like decision-making body. And what happens is the local kleptocracies that are represented, either representing Greece or Montenegro or North Macedonia, they simply fit into the model, trying to extract some economic rents for themselves, which the central hidden directorate allows them to have to keep their mouth shut, get out of the way, and stop meddling. If you look at the most successful, compare and contrast the government in which I served of Greece with Orban and their respective relationship with the center of the EU. Our government in 2015 tried to prevent the loss of 100 euros a month from, pensioners who were eating out of rubbish bins because their total income was 300. They wanted to bring down their income from 300 to 200. And they shut down our banks for that, which is the equivalent of an invasion, a financial invasion, the equivalent of terrorism, financial terrorism. You close down a country's banks if you want to terrorize the population into submission. This is what they did. What did they do to Orban, to the Poles? Nothing, absolutely nothing. The neo-fascists in Budapest, very smart people, extremely smart people, know how to stay out of the euro. Look at the Polish government. They don't fall into the trap of entering the euro. They know how to use the single market in order to propagate the exports and the sales of the companies that are owned by the kleptocracy in the center of those regimes. They know how to support the worst parts of the EU and fight all the progressive things of the EU. So having countries like that are ruled by a very right-wing kleptocracies is not going to help us reform or transform the EU. It doesn't make the EU a more progressive place, and it doesn't make those countries more prosperous. Especially not from now on, because one could say with some reason that Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary benefited a lot financially from the EU. They did. That was a different time. The EU was much richer. It was before the crisis. And those countries that I mentioned were hardwired into the German industrial machinery. something that will not be the case for Northern Macedonia. It will not be the case for Montenegro. If anything, the German industrial machinery is now rusting away as a result of the collapse of the German economic model. So I don't think that the scales are weighing on the side of the pros versus the cons that Eric mentioned. This is my view. Again, I'm perfectly willing to defer to you folks who are in Montenegro, in Northern Macedonia, in Serbia, while maintaining my right as a member of DiEM to have a final view on this. But Eric is right. I think that we are not going to come to conclusions today, but it's a good start of a DiEM debate amongst ourselves, leading perhaps to a series of AMVs, all member votes, for those who don't know what our acronyms mean. One question that Eric raised is, should we have a homogeneous position? That is either yes to countries entering, to all of them, or to anyone that wants to enter, or no. Should we have a homogeneous position, or could we, for instance, say that in the case of Turkey, we're against, because the people of Turkey will be worse off, and they will be financially worse off if they enter the EU. There's no doubt about that. The working class of Turkey is going to do much worse if they are inside the EU. Whereas to say that in the case of Montenegro, because the circumstances are very different, we would favor the entry of Montenegro to the EU. The examples I gave are neither here nor there. Do we really need, Eric, to be homogeneous, to say, one rule for all, either all of them stay out or all of them come in? That's one question. I don't have an answer, but this is a question that we can debate amongst themselves and formulate a policy. And the second question is, okay, if we decide homogeneously, is it yes or no? And if it's heterogeneous, which ones do we propose should enter and which ones do we propose shouldn't enter? This is a very interesting discussion to be had within DiEM.
Yeah, definitely. Maya?
Yes, I would just want to add, because I think I had a question for Yanis, but I think that he actually answered it now. But I just wanted to add one thing, because it's not a black and white position. I think that now, after hearing Dusan, who is completely pro-entering EU, and his position of Montenegro that I can, of course, understand, and then hearing the whole position of Yanis and Greece, and having the whole reflection on how it went off with Greece, and us thinking if we should enter the EU after 30 years of waiting, and if we're good children and do everything we can and recognize Kosovo and impose sanctions against Russia and stuff like that. And I think that it is a question, it's also a question being raised, maybe to think about it in the future. And that is that there is a problem that at this moment in history, entering the EU and being a part of the EU or European story is being a part of the right side of history. That is what they are telling us here. If you're now, which we started at the beginning of this discussion, that it's they are telling us that if you are not pro-EU, you're not on the right side of history. But now hearing everything that Yanis said and other people, is this the right part of history? And is there a third alternative? I think the most maybe difficult thing is to imagine this utopistic other alternative, and maybe we can try to imagine it in another live stream in the future. I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Maya. And I think that's a great point, because I think this is part of why it's so difficult to have these discussions as well, is that the EU has done such a good job over the course of decades to really present itself not only as inescapable, but also as something that's sort of distant, but positive on the whole, and that we should just accept and sort of admire in a sense, even though, as we know, if you look closely, it has a lot of problems. Amir, what's your take on this?
Well, I've been trying to get through this long report issued by the EU about where Bosnia and Herzegovina is regarding joining the EU. Well, apart from the conditions being very market friendly, and that's all that matters, of course, we know that. The goalposts also keep shifting, looking at even what Ivana was saying earlier on. So it's not only the 14 key priority areas that Bosnia has been communicated that they need to fill, and an additional 8 got added on just very recently. And I want to just quickly focus on this because we're talking about these countries joining or not joining, but we've also got our constant narrative around the lack of democratization in Europe and how that there's an internal contradiction in this process. Let me just give me 1 minute to just go through one critique of the EU over Bosnia, and then maybe help illustrate this, because in this report, the European Union is critical of the lack of constitutional electoral reforms in Bosnia, but is completely fine and shamefully comfortable with the use of draconian use of power vested in the office of the High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina. This office is currently occupied by Christian Schmidt and benefits from zero accountability, and there's no possibility of appeal on any decision that this office makes. And just to mention that the Deputy High Representative happens to has always been American, from the United States, State Department, and the previous high commissioners have been German, Austrian, and so on. So we can see perhaps that there's no democratic choice here at all in terms of a viceroy making decisions for the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this person that's chosen is picked by the so-called Peace Implementation Council, which has no basis in international law. So again, we have zero democratic participation in any decision-making here. And so here the EU is critical of how the Bosnians are running their fragile democracy in a way, and at the same time they have a draconian person that overrules anything that is not fit for the sort of mercantilist EU future. And the latest use of this excessive power was on the 2nd of October. Mr. Schmidt imposed a new electoral law as soon as the elections closed. So people went to the polls, put in their choice in the ballot box, polls closed at 7 p.m. for argument's sake, and then a new law was put in place by the Office of the High Representative, just like that. And this imposition actually further entrenches ethno-nationalism in a country where voters are trying to get away from ethno-nationalism and into just daily issues. And actually this law was first mooted in July, and there was broad popular protest against it. Civil society, the public, and political parties. But of course, again, when it comes to the EU, as we know, the will of the people be damned, because a representative of the garden knows better.
Thanks, Amir. And yeah, it's something that, say what you will about the EU, but something that they will always have endless supply of is unelected bureaucrats, right? Ivana, can I bring you in to wrap up the discussion?
Yes, thank you, Lucas, and thanks everybody for this hopefully beginning of this discussion, because there are many layers, and it's not just about whether or not 5 countries from this part of Europe will join the EU or not. It uncovers multiple layers, and I would really like to continue talking about this, also reflecting on some of the things that were good in ex-Yugoslavia. Most of the people who have any idea about this former country think of war and how badly it ended. But Yugoslavia was a functional socialist country, and there are lessons to be learned, both from those things that were good, as well as from its disintegration. Because, looking at Yugoslavia, 6 republics in federation, they didn't, separate its ways in a peaceful manner. And if EU is going to collapse, I'm afraid that it's not going to be in a peaceful manner. but we can already have a glimpse of a bloody war that might come to end of this union. Not to end it on this depressive side. I always believed that, and that's why I joined DiEM in 2016, that it's not possible to fight the EU bureaucracy that you just mentioned on your own, that you need more countries and more parties for the beginning in the EU Parliament in order to fight the system from within. In these 6 years, a lot of things changed, and it's even worse than 6 years ago. But as DiEMers, we should not give up the idea of united Europe for the people and not corporations. Carpe diem.
Thank you, Ivana. It's good to end on a positive note after such a thorny discussion. And it's a thorny discussion that, as a lot of people mentioned, will continue. It's a discussion that we need to have within DiEM, not to mention European society as a whole. And the good thing is you can be part of this discussion. If you're not yet a member of DiEM25, you can join by going to diem25.org/join. The link is in the chat. And you can be part of this democratic process. As Yanis mentioned earlier, all of our major decisions on policy are taken through a vote involving all members. You can shape policy, and you can essentially be part of the only movement out there really that is transnational and that is having those discussions and is progressive as well and radical. Thank you so much for joining us. We will see you again